Good morning, everyone. Today I am here with Veera Johnson and Karl McDermott, two experts in circular economy and technology. It is a pleasure to be here with you today. To give a brief introduction about Veera Johnson, she is the co-founder at Circulor. Circulor's mission is traceability and due diligence of raw materials from source to manufacturer. And she focuses on primary markets such as minerals used in electric vehicles and consumer electronics. In May 2009, Veera was named Businesswoman of the Year at the Asian Women of Achievement Awards. It is an absolute pleasure to have you here today. Thank you, Veera.
Thank you, Madison, for that amazing introduction too.
Of course. And we also have Karl McDermott here, as I mentioned. Karl is the Global Head of Business Development at Morpheus Network. Morpheus Network's vision is for effective, fair, and a more sustainable commerce. Their leading platform digitizes supply chains, uses technologies such as blockchain and other AI technologies. So it's great today. We're going to discuss some circular economy principles as well as technologies, that Morpheus Network and Karl can talk a little bit more about how we can really put this circular economy and circular supply chain mindset into practice in real economies. So without further ado, I want to start by asking Veera a few questions, about circular economy and Circulor. And, then we can go on to connect, both of your ideas on traceability and circular economy, because, you might be from a different, area or sector, but there are similarities and, common lines throughout both. So first, Veera, what is the mission of Circulor? I know I gave a brief introduction to it, but if you'd like to share with our audience the true mission of Circulor.
Sure. So as a business, we've been going, this is actually our fourth year now. And when we set the business up, we realized very quickly that global supply chains, they're complex, they're fraught with human rights issues, and particularly when we're tracing raw materials as they change state. That's actually quite a complex and challenging outcome to achieve. So as a company, our mission and our vision is to be able to create transparent supply chains and provide OEMs, tier one manufacturers and recyclers with data, particularly data that's previously been inaccessible about their supply chains and the sourcing of their raw materials, and how they are then able to use that data to make empowered decisions about reducing carbon emissions in their manufacturing processes, but equally making responsible sourcing decisions such that the impact on our people and our planet is reduced into the future.
Great, thank you so much. And I think my next question was for you was, a little bit about that, and how are you currently transforming the supply chain to be more circular with your mission at Circulor? Maybe can you give us a few specifics, examples of some of the things that you've just mentioned within your guys' mission?
Sure. So for our clients, what we provide is a technology platform that is built on Hyperledger Fabric as a blockchain layer that allows us to create an immutable record of material as it changes physical state. So we're not tracking the paperwork as a proxy for the material. We're actually tracking the actual material itself, all the way from source, for example, a mine in Africa, such as cobalt, mica, nickel, as it goes into a chemical refining process, as it goes into a cathode producer, as it gets assembled into an electric vehicle. So for example, for Volvo, we're tracing mica and cobalt, and we're going to be slowly adding additional materials through the course of this year. Whilst we're doing that, because we know the mass balance of material at any particular step in the process, we're able to attach the carbon emission footprint for that particular product, all the way from scope 1 emissions, scope 2 brought-in emissions, and scope 3 inherited emissions. And through using a combination of IoT and additional application layers, we're able to create a dynamic chain of custody, which means at any point in time, as the material changes state, we can see where there are anomalies, and we can prove the provenance of the materials, and that, for example, no child labour is being used. What that allows organisations to do is, most importantly, gain visibility into the entirety of their supply chain, all the way from source to end product, which means from a circular economy perspective, and a sustainable supply chain perspective, we're not only able to look at the first use of material, but also the second use as it goes into a second life. For example, of the battery, the materials can get recycled and then reused for a second use into an alternative product, but equally reused for something completely separate to what it originally started out from. So from that perspective, we're enabling transparency to drive sustainable supply chains and to encourage the circular economy.
Wow, that is incredible. It's just a great example about technology and how, starting with tracing, back all the way to those minerals and the amount of circular steps that then come from that initial ability there to apply those technologies definitely leads us to a circular supply chain and gives your clients those steps that can get them there. And I think something important that comes from what you've just mentioned is, what truly is the difference between sustainable supply chain and a circular supply chain? You talk about sustainability, but Circulor is the mission here and who you're from. So how are you differentiating the two and how are they intertwined?
Sure. So how I would distinguish between the two, I guess, outcomes is that from a circular supply chain point of view, it's the way in which material is used as part of creating a product, but it's how do you encourage manufacturers and remanufacturers to remake them for resale into something else. So therefore, there is a circular economy for the raw material itself. A sustainable supply chain is beyond that, in the sense that they are providing the ability to not only tap into the impacts on the environment, the social impact and human impact, looking at the economic impact of those supply chains, and ensuring that by taking that holistic approach, they're able to reduce waste and reduce the impacts of the carbon emission footprint for the production of that particular product. And therefore, sustainable supply chains tend to be much more linear. However, when you combine the two together through transparency data, through the chain of custody, you can create an economy of what I would call a circular economy, a genuine circular economy, for the reuse and reducing the footprint of material in the first place.
Great, that's phenomenal. That's something that definitely at ISCEA we talk about. The importance of circular supply chain and sustainable practices, like you said, are essential to achieving this circular economies, genuine circular economies. But I think it's important. It's a question that's asked many times. What is the difference? Because sometimes they're intertwined, in conversation, and in nature they're not the same thing, but they definitely, lean on each other and are dependent upon each other. So it's really something interesting that I like to bring up. And currently, in your opinion, what are the most important sustainable practices that will minimize the gaps in circularity or in circular supply chain? So, what are the most strong linear ties that would allow our economies to shape into that circular nature?
I think we're at the only very early stages of achieving genuine transparency in supply chains. And by that, I mean all the way down to the tier 7, the tier 10 suppliers, right down to artisanal miners, artisanal producers. Once we have transparency within the supply chain, that drives a whole series of different discussions. Data-driven supply chain transformation with me is a really big thing. And we're only at the early stages of uncovering how powerful that data can be to reduce the supply chain, to improve the production practices used within individual participants or by participants within supply chains, so that you have a holistic view. And in my mind, what drives that makes that really, really effective is by digitizing supply chains and doing it dynamically such that data is captured not through one-off spot audits, but is genuinely captured as a material goes through a supply chain, or equally within recycling and plastics recycling supply chains. So for me, that's the first priority. The second one, I think, is creating a genuine conversation within the supply chain community, within individual supply chains, such they achieve shared goals, shared ambitions, and shared objectives to make sustainable supply chains work practically. using different commercial models, using different incentives, but also rewarding organizations to make them systemic, so that it's not just done as a one-off exercise, it's designed into processes. And lastly, that drives different commercial outcomes for organizations. It's okay to be profitable for good, but what does that actually mean? Unpacking it so that there is a shared set of goals to make that happen.
Definitely. And I think the idea of sharing knowledge and making these steps together in economy is very important. And that also leads into kind of the last large question I had for you was, how can we connect circular supply chains to overall circular economy? I know you've touched on this, with being transparent and digitizing and things like that. So I think you've kind of already answered that question throughout the scope of this, series. But maybe we can take it a step forward, and I'll ask you: do you think that circular supply chains should be intertwined? Maybe from different industries or different minerals, for example, or should they remain circular independently? Or maybe is it a mix of both? Are supply chains independently circular and circular to create that circular economy? What is your take on that?
I think it's a journey, and the journey starts with initially understanding what is happening within individual supply chains, and we're starting to see some amazing projects emerging from the perspective of achieving that. And therefore, to start with, they've been done independently. But the power of combining them and intertwining them is only in the early stages of being understood. So I do think we'll get to intertwined, interconnected, circular economy supply chains, but we're probably 10 years away from that. And therefore, how do we make that happen? How do we incentivize organizations to put this top of their agenda? So not just stating their sustainability goals, but demonstrating what they are actually doing on the ground to get to that outcome.
Definitely. And I think, what we're doing to get to these outcomes, like you just said, is very important. And this is where I want to, bring in Karl and get his perspective and expertise on traceability and technologies. Working with Morpheus Network, technologies and blockchain is very, one of their focuses. So, Karl, what role does traceability have in moving toward a successful circular economy?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Madison. And let me just congratulate Veera and Circulor for the great work they're doing. Morpheus Network is a middleware solution for automating and digitizing supply chains. And I guess what we've seen in the post-pandemic is that digitization is becoming front and center. It's like a big issue that now, was maybe a footnote in the strat plans of many organizations. Now, digitizing the supply chains front and center. But I think, Veera has a very important point to make, is we can't just do digitization for an end to itself. Digitization needs to be included with, obviously, a strong focus around SDG goals. And there we could see that was not obviously around sustainability, but also around circular. So I think like an overarching approach where you have digitization of supply chains, with a strong focus around, traceability and transparency towards sustainability, and then incorporating the circular methods that I think Veera mentioned is obviously, the end goal that we're all looking towards. And there's no earning calls today, from any of the Fortune, let's say 2000, where sustainability is now, not being discussed at that forum. So I think investors have it very clear. I think consumers have it very clear. I think there's that article that came out with Forbes last year that, purpose, focused organizations are going to be, 6 times more likely to be championed by investors and also by consumers if they get this whole focus of digitization, sustainability, and circular correct.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I think it's, there's definitely steps that we're taking, as a global economy to get there, and it's definitely becoming a louder conversation in time. And I think it's very interesting to discuss maybe some of the specific steps that you're taking in your role as global head of business development at Morpheus Network. Now than ever, maybe circular economy has become a focus. And, what are some specific technologies that you think are, going to really push our economy to be more circular, and hopefully achieve some of these goals that we have?
Yeah, great question. So again, Veera mentioned the idea of scope, right? Scope 1, scope 2, scope 3. 80% of emissions, for example, fall outside your organization. So capturing those either from a product or a process perspective is going to become critical if we're going to start improving on sustainability and circular across the board. So obviously some of the key technologies there are around maybe creating transparent data sets. I think blockchain technologies is really useful for that. Creating trusted, transparent data sets that can be shared across organizations. So again, I don't think we've gone down to tier 12 or tier 10 providers like Veera had mentioned, but normally we go down to maybe a tier 3. And let's say that's an automotive company, so they're producing some parts, and then obviously those parts are produced up for sub-assembly, and then obviously, later on to, full assembly and then into the OEM. And obviously we want to try and capture then not just the supply chain moves, the how we optimize the supply chain, and save money across the board, by reducing inefficiencies, but we want to capture then the outputs of the process, right? The cost required, not just from an economic perspective, from a sustainability perspective on, what it took to transform that product, transform that part into a component, the component into a sub-assembly. I think that's, again, where technologies like blockchain and how we're using that at Morpheus and also at for the team at Circulor can create those data sets, share them across the value chain, and then improve reporting from beginning to end. That's really, we can really create the biggest impact.
For sure. And I think we talk about, blockchain, you both have mentioned it, but before, and maybe we should have talked about this in the beginning, but maybe can you, either of you or Karl, maybe provide some information about what blockchain is for those that might not be familiar. I know a lot of our global members are experts in supply chain, but maybe not blockchain. Maybe just something general here.
Yeah, so blockchain is a distributed database. And one of the benefits of being a distributed database, it means it's really difficult to change data without the permission of all the people, all the nodes, if you like, that hold a piece of data. So one of the key reasons we like blockchain for supply chain is it makes it easy to create trusted data sets. So if I'm creating, let's say, a bill of lading, I want to share that across, from the shipper to the, let's say, the freight forwarder to the carrier, we can do that on trusted data sets. So, we really like blockchain for that reason. It's easy to create trusted data sets, easy to store and easy to share on a permission basis. And that's maybe very different for some of the, existing cloud technologies. And I think no week goes by that you don't hear about some new data hack, right? But then, some data is kind of critical for an organization. It's been hacked, it's been changed. Blockchain provides you with a suite of technologies in order to prevent that. That's really what we see the biggest benefits. I think, Veera, what would you add to that?
I think that was a very neat summary, Karl. Thank you. I would say the only other thing that we do on top of what Karl's discussed is that we provide additional layers of security because of the value of the material going through the supply chain. So we use specific one-time use QR codes and tagging. We use facial recognition and geolocation spoofing to make sure that as part of the record being written to the blockchain, we also have date stamps within it and these additional levels of security to provide that trusted chain of custody.
Yeah, thanks for adding those points. Really, really very useful. I guess another question, and maybe I'm just jumping ahead here, Madison, but would be about standards, right? So one of the key things that we're looking for, not just from a technology perspective, sharing data on blockchain, but also I think with this twin thrust or twin trident of sustainability, digitization, and circular. I guess a good question for Veera is, how can we begin to look at standards that would help drive adoption, help drive change across the whole of a supply chain and maybe not just a particular company?
Sure. I think in terms of crossing over between products and participants and networks within the community, interoperability of systems is going to be a key thing and will become more and more of a requirement as we start to see more and more blockchain solutions rolled out into the environment to deliver sustainable supply chains. The second for me also is that there are a huge number of regulations that are specific to individual sectors, and therefore the application of those standards and those regulatory frameworks, I think, will start to merge and converge over a period of time, which again will start to set the standards for the way in which blockchain could be used to drive consistent data sets, but also in terms of creating that level of trust as a core standard.
Great. That was, very interesting, comment from both of you guys. And I think we talk about the use of these blockchain technologies to really push the future of circularity and pushing to deliver these sustainable supply chains. So maybe this is a question for both of you. And I think, Karl specifically, as the head of global business development, can you talk about the importance of applying blockchain technologies and traceable solutions at all steps in business development, including, maybe corporations that might not be fully developed in their own supply chains? How important are those technologies in early stages of supply chain? Because, at ISCEA, we talk about how each step of the supply chain has to be circular in itself to the highest degree, so that we can ensure later on the supply chain, we can loop everything back. Because you don't want to get to the last step of your supply chain and then start to think about, okay, now we want to be circular, what can we do? Because you then miss out on some of those opportunities for efficiency, to reduce any of those inefficiencies. So, what is and how important is it to apply technologies at all steps of business development?
Yeah, so I think there's really two questions there. One would be around how we might use these trusted data sets. I'll cover that first. And the second, how we could maybe ensure that SMEs, like some of the smaller corporations, can actually also participate in sustainability and circular. So I think that first question is, if we've got trusted data sets that are being passed and being added to, if you like, through a value chain, so going to that whole scope-free value chain, then obviously if we start to use the trusted data sets and build on top of that, so one way to build on top of that would be a smart contract, right? So we use smart contracts for different reasons. So one of those would be an insurance event. So we store some IoT data, we put that in a smart contract, and then if there's let's say a catastrophic event to the load, we know who was responsible, we know how to do the reordering and how to kick off an insurance claim, and we can use smart contracts to help that. But I also think there's like a good use of smart contracts in sustainability and also in circularity, where we can continue to build on trusted data sets, from the lower tiers up to the upper tiers, like down upstream to downstream, and ensure that these smart contracts then are actually being used to create proper calculations for emissions, proper calculations for circularity. Again, probably some of the formulas that Veera and her company know very well. But I think smart contracts is a great value add to have once you've got trusted data sets. Coming back to that second question then is, we are seeing a lot of interest from not just large corporations and national governments, but also some smaller and medium enterprises in the process of digitization. I think that's probably what we understand best. Maybe Veera can talk a little bit more about that from the circular side, but we do think that these digital technologies have a lower price point, have an easier access for smaller and medium companies to participate in global supply chains. So, a great option again would be, let's say, trade finance. A large corporation, they don't need, access to finance in order to empower the flow of goods through a value chain or through a supply chain. Some of those smaller companies, and I think, maybe it's up to like 90% of global trade is actually done through trade finance. They can't participate because the manual or analog data captured, the documents just take too long, and the actual possibility of actually getting then trade finance is lower. So I think digitization and digital onboarding of something like trade finance will really help the SMEs participate in global supply chains, And that's how we can create an overarching transformation from beginning to end, not just saving money, but saving the resources of the planet.
I would absolutely support that, Karl. And one of the examples that we have, which we're currently working our way through, is the way in which we deal with artisanal miners in the Democratic Republic of Congo, which, as you can imagine, is strife with human rights challenges, but also the ways in which we can support the local communities and the individual artisanal miners with prompt payment, and also managing the process by which they're paid, such that they get the money in a timely way, using different currency arrangements, particularly to make sure that there is no fraud within the system introduced. So absolutely, from that perspective, blockchain does provide us with an additional layer of trust, but also the ability to test out new commercial models, particularly where much smaller scale businesses are involved.
Yeah, and I'd just like to add to that, so companies like Morpheus and I think also Circulor, we want to demystify the blockchains. And a lot of people obviously have a misunderstanding about it. Maybe they associate it with cryptocurrency and speculation. Obviously, blockchain's one of these once in a lifetime transformational technologies, but you don't have to be an expert in blockchain to use our platforms. And I think probably that's very, very much the same with Veera's company and ours at Morpheus. We'll try and ensure that the data layer where we store it and make this tamper-proof and make it trusted is really easy to use from an end user perspective. And that also goes into like sharing data between applications. So, we run on Hyperledger, we also run on Ethereum and EOS and some other blockchains. It would be really easy for us to share data sets between, Morpheus and Veera's company, as products or goods move through the supply chain, and to create those, circular and sustainability reports and disclosures.
Thank you both. I think there's a great conversation here going, just how both of you guys connect to these technologies, and you think of it maybe in a little bit differently, but at the end of the day, there's so much overlap and so much potential here to really utilize these technologies, and just get this conversation going. And like you said, sometimes there's misunderstanding about what it is or how we can apply it, but at the end of the day, we want to make things more efficient. We want to, save money for these supply chains, reduce any inefficiencies. So I think there's definitely a shared mission here between the three of us, especially the two of you. And I want to kind of start to, wrap up this conversation, but this is a question for both of you guys. And I think throughout this entire conversation, we've touched upon this, but you can use this as a recap. And, just in summary, where do you both see the future of supply chain heading in terms of standards for adopting technologies such as blockchain and traceable technologies that really allow, Veera, like you said, going back, starting at that source, and then Karl, you talked about moving from step to step. How do you guys see the future of supply chain with these adopted technologies and standards for them?
Sure, perhaps I'll go first then. The biggest challenge we had over the last 30 years has been most organizations, particularly manufacturers, OEMs, recyclers, have outsourced their supply chains to create agility and flexibility in their financial models within supply chains. And a consequence of that has been loss of transparency and loss of control of supply chains. Where I see blockchain and blockchain-enabled solutions like ours and Karl's is that these are now providing tools and mechanisms in a very easy to adopt way to regain some of that visibility back. And I would say that over the next 10 years, supply chain and transformation and sustainability will have a much stronger voice at the board. And therefore, a company's objectives, goals are going to be much more aligned with sustainable objectives, but also in line with investor requirements and us as consumers in terms of what we demand of organizations and what we demand of organizations to demonstrate back to us. So I see this as a very, very early stage of a major transformation over the next 10 years.
Yeah, and I'd just like to add to that. I think a lot of the global supply chains were based on free trade agreements, right? And it's basically a sourcing decision, but there weren't decisions around sustainability and circular. And I think that was very clear from the pandemic, right? We kind of, when we really needed to see and get that item level visibility, it just wasn't happening. So I think there is like a groundswell of change right now. And, I think digitization is one of the tools that's helping drive that transformation. And I think some of those outcomes are definitely at a board level now, it's the economic output. Are we saving money from the supply chain? But also the sustainability angle, right? If we're shipping, let's say, containers of tequila from Mexico to the UK, how expensive is that from a supply chain perspective? And do we fully understand not just the economic cost, but the sustainability costs of that? So I think if those discussions are being had at the board level with the investor community and with consumers, then I think we've got basically a platform for change. I think that's what we're trying to drive here. Let's ensure that the supply chains are efficient. Let's ensure that they're effective, but let's also ensure they're fair, inclusive, and sustainable.
Great. Thank you guys so much for your time today. I think that without even saying anything else, we can all agree here that there's so much more room for progress in terms of moving towards circularity, but technology such as blockchain that you're both, working towards each and every day in your roles at Morpheus Network and Circulor are so important to moving towards our end goal. At the end of the day, we want to transform these supply chains. And I think that you both are doing it, in different ways, but using similar methodologies. But at the end of the day, we're all going to come together, hopefully. And like Veera said, it's going to take some time. You can't wake up and we're not going to have a circular economy over time, but it's the everyday work and the everyday small steps and the everyday movement towards some of these technology standards that are so important. So I really do want to thank you guys for your continued work and all of the hard work you guys are doing in terms of applying these technologies and continuing to make them more effective and really applicable to these industries. And if there is anything else that you want to share with each other or ask each other, feel free to do so. Or just final thoughts in general about sustainability or circular economy. This is kind of your time to bring anything up.
No, I think we've got a good opportunity to collaborate with companies like Circulor, and that obviously Veera's heading up. I would also like anyone listening in the audience to look at some of the training options that ISCEA offers, specifically around certified sustainable supply chain professionals. So that's an amazing program. I invite anyone listening to have a look at that. I think we're starting out on this journey. I think, as Veera said, probably we're going to see a lot of changes over the next 10 years. And I think it's obviously a very exciting time for anyone in supply chain, in software or digitization, and then looking at those interesting outcomes of saving money, but also saving the planet and the resources.
I totally agree with that. And I would just say to add, if anybody on this session is interested in following up either with myself or Karl, I'm sure we'd both be happy to pick up the phone and have a discussion.
Sure will.
Definitely. I know at ISCEA, we're very excited to see where the future of sustainability and circularity goes. Karl, you're familiar with RSC Tech, and Veera, just to give you a quick breakdown, that's our technology conference that we host every year. And I think it's, really eye-opening to think that circularity and sustainability in supply chain kind of has been a pretty recent topic that has come to focus, through our conferences and through conversations with our partners, and seeing that is something that is really a topic of concern and innovation. And I think it's really inspiring to see the amount of change that we've already seen in such a short period of time, and like Karl just mentioned, the importance of education. I know that the CSSCP was created in mind to help educate our global members on the ideas of circularity and sustainable supply chain, and hopefully through that learn a little bit more about technologies. But I do invite our global members to reach out to both of you to learn a bit more about technologies like blockchain and others that will enhance this traceability and move us towards a not only circular supply chains, but the overall goal of a circular economy. So thank you guys so much for your time today and your continued work. Like I said, I'm sure we'll be working together, in the future, and we'll keep this conversation going. Thank you again, Veera. Thank you again, Karl. It has been an absolute pleasure to talk with you both today.
Yes, thank you, Madison, for the invitation. And again, great to meet Veera. I'll be looking for you on LinkedIn when we finish up the call.
Perfect. Thank you. And thank you again, Madison.
Of course.